What happens if you bring 20 public intellectuals together to apply their expertise to the most pressing issue of our time? The result would probably look something like the Quarantine Files. It's a collection of writing published by the Los Angeles Review of Books, and it features renowned critical thinkers and artists reflecting on COVID-19 and its potential society-altering consequences. Well, Curator Brad Evans is the man who brought them all together. He's a professor of political philosophy at the University of Bath. And Simon Critchley is one of the theorists who contributed to the collection. He's the Hans Jonas Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York. Good to have you both on the Newsmakers. Brad Evans, I wonder, it seems as if we're asking the right questions over the past couple of months. What's been most surprising to you as you've curated some of these thoughts from interesting people?
I guess a whole number of things in terms of the way in which the pandemic reveals very different concerns for very different thinkers. And I think perhaps the thing that came out from me was how the experience of the pandemic is felt very differently dependent on who you are, where you are in the world. So there needs to be a space for a much more open dialogue in terms of the different ways in which it seemed to impact upon different people's lives.
So, Brad, are there fewer common threads than we imagined? I mean, is it less a one-size-fits-all when we look at people giving grand theories and pieces of advice to responding to the pandemic or what to do after the pandemic?
Well, I don't think one grand theory is ever going to resolve anything, and certainly not in this context. I think there's certainly the room for multiple interpretations of what this means, and that does, as Simon points out in his contribution, take some time to reflect. But we also do need to be, I think, very attentive to many of the very fast dynamics that are taking place all around us right now.
Simon Critchley, one of the things I've been philosophizing over, looking at the top that you're wearing, is whether all of this was just a Manchester United fans' dreams and prayers just sort of going too far or getting answered too well, right? I'm a Man United fan.
Right. It's a global conspiracy to stop Liverpool winning the English Premier League.
Yeah. So, Simon, what's been sort of churning in your mind over the past couple of months?
Well, I've actually had a great pandemic. Because, for people like me, I mean, I've been self-isolating my whole life. So this is kind of, it's remarkably normal in many ways. And I think it's woken up the world up to, a set of concerns which are close to my heart. And it's reminded us of things which we'd forgotten, like the fact of plague. I mean, I'm a student of ancient history, and if you read ancient history or indeed modern history, it's defined by plague. This is how empires collapse, go into decline, shift. And it also reminds us about the modesty of real science, how important real science is and how modest it is as an activity, how little we know.
Right. Brad Evans, in terms of how we've reacted to this plague, have we followed the same patterns of behavior that other humans have followed in previous pandemics, previous plagues?
Well, I think Simon's point about the historical significance is really well made, and we need to really keep a hold of that understanding. I think what's very evident in the current pandemic is how quickly the plague has actually been politicized and weaponized. And that seems to be a very dangerous and frightening move in the current kind of moment. And this started very quickly in terms of all the war narratives which surround it. Now, we know in terms of history, there's always been this kind of correlation between plagues and wars. But the way in which the language has been weaponized very quickly, I think that has been perhaps not necessarily a new departure, but it's certainly been at the forefront of the way in which this has been accelerated, especially across social media and elsewhere.
Yeah. So, Simon, with that weaponization and people exploiting it, there's a lot of noise, right? I see a lot of shoehorning of people's pre-existing notions of how the world should be run. Whether if somebody's a socialist, they say, you see, we need to be socialists. That would prevent the plague or solve the plague. If somebody's a vegan, the same. If somebody's a libertarian, they say, you see, I need my guns and the government shouldn't try and force me to wear a mask and so on. So with all of that noise and with all that exploitation and weaponizing, both sometimes literally, of this plague, it becomes bewildering for people sometimes, right? How do you actually sort of then find a way to step out of it, take a breath, and gain perspective?
Well, Imran, it's a good question. I mean, it's where I live in New York. There's been far too much noise, and I think it's revealed the limits, in a way, the limits to what the depth of the lies that can be told. Right. That it's also revealed the fact that despite the rise of populism in places like Brazil, the United States, the UK, in a slightly different way, government is a different thing. Government as a kind of just a way of reassuring people and having an issue like public health as the central issue of government policy is actually rather important. And you see the absence of that in the Trump administration's response to this crisis, which has been hideous.
Brad, is there something to be said about the fact that despite all of this information, we can actually have, in real time, we can be connected to the experts, they can explain the science, we can have all the data in the world and all the empirical explanations, but on WhatsApp and on Facebook and on Twitter and so on, people are sharing information about how Bill Gates wants to control you. I don't know. They want to take away our freedoms, do something terrible to us. This is a conspiracy. This was manufactured in a lab. Why is there still so much misinformation, Brad?
Well, I think perhaps part of our problem is that it's not that we lack communication, we maybe lack resistance to the present. And I think one of the problems that we have is almost too much information that's being peddled around, and nobody's taken advantage of the kind of advent of new media technologies than, for instance, Trump in America. So we have to question, first of all, whether technology in itself is necessarily a good. And certainly, it's great, for instance, in terms of these kinds of forums, right? We can have real sort of detailed conversations which kind of break down the idea of space and time, and we can speak to one another across the planet, and certainly that has a lot of benefits to it. But I do think there is something also taking place here with new media technologies, especially in the advent of this pandemic, because we have to look at the real winners who seem to be emerging out of this crisis is precisely the tech firms. And we know there's a very troubled history around that. So how we make sense of that, I think, is also something we need to be very alert to, particularly the advent of it, like in the UK now. Boris Johnson announced yesterday this new kind of shift in the tracking apps. And we have to really question the democratic oversight of these things.
Simon, do you share those concerns about surveillance and other forms of government overreach as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, going back to something that Brad was saying, I think we're in a state of kind of hyper arousal through social media, and we live in a kind of what Virginia Heffernan calls a hyperlexia. We're constantly reading, we're constantly absorbing material, and this is good and it's bad. And in relationship to what you said, Imran, about conspiracy theories, I mean, conspiracy theories are, a fact of life in the United States. There's a great book called The Paranoid Style in American Politics from the early 60s, Hofstadter. But those conspiracy theories have been ramped up by new technology. So we're in a situation where we have mechanisms, social media mechanisms, which are brilliant at exaggerating conspiracy theories. How do you make those go away? Well, I don't think they are going to go away. All you have to do is kind of persist with simple, clear, true messages. And it does remind us of the need for expertise at times like this. The epidemiologists are actually pretty useful people. And although I will say, which is a thing which, this feels heretical to say it at this point, but I think it has to be said, is that the models were wrong, right? The models that have been used, the predictive models, particularly the one that came out of, say, Imperial College that the UK and the US used, the mortality rates were wildly wrong. And so we tend to, so in the face of conspiracy theories, on the one hand, people talk about the science and the facts. That's also too naive, right? We shouldn't just believe in the science. Science is a complex process. It's linked to social, economic, and other systems, and we have to understand that. So we've ended up in this kind of stupid conflict between, either believing everything's okay or believing in the science, and that's a kind of
no, that's true.
a
And
silly
of
choice,
course, talking about the exploitation, if the models are wrong, it doesn't necessarily mean that people who believe that this is all a myth are right, which they use to advance their own theories and so on. And it adds to that noise that we spoke about, right, Simon?
Right, because science works through trial and error. So you produce models and then you adjust those models on the basis of what actually happens. So the models have been readjusted in the light of contagion rates, mortality rates, and so on and so forth. So we will have better models in the future.
Right. So Brad, you've been quite productive in getting all these voices together, creating this sort of forum, particularly with the physical restrictions that we have. So, harnessing the power of the internet to get smart people to discuss some of these big issues. People talk about the fact, I don't even know if it's a myth or not, but they say Shakespeare wrote King Lear while under quarantine during the plague, right? I mean, I struggle to reply to emails, so I feel very guilty whenever I read that, right? When we look, Brad, at this concept of being creative, of finding a way to do great things in spite of the restrictions, in spite of this global pandemic, what have you seen so far? We've had enough of a sample now over the past couple of months. What have you seen, besides people making stupid TikTok videos at home, right? What have you seen emerging from people, Brad, that gives you hope in this idea that people will produce things that will surprise you despite the circumstances?
Well, first of all, I don't think I've actually been in any way productive. I keep looking at it every day and think, well, I'm doing something, and then actually I have a list of things I'd like to do, but don't actually end up doing them. So, and actually, I think that this volume was interesting to put it together, and it was a pleasure to put it together, drawn upon a number of people, like good friends like Simon, who I could ask to invite and would contribute. And it's certainly not comparable to a King Lear, right? What we've put together there. So I think there's something in that we need to kind of be a bit more humble in terms of the things that we'd actually put it out at the minute. So I do think that there are certainly you would hope that in times of crisis that that comes through. It's something that we might call magnificently creative, but it's certainly too soon to tell what that is going to be. People often talk about the great writings which come out in times of crisis. I'm often reminded of the work of Caravaggio as well, and the way in which he responds to the Black Death and so forth. But, who is the Caravaggio today? We have no idea what that looks like. So I think that this thing does take time for it to materialize.
Simon Critchley, once again, just a reminder, it's likely that Liverpool won't get the trophy this season, and I'm sorry about that. But
no, you're delusional, Imran. You're
I'm just a Manchester United fan, okay? It's been a rough 7 years. So, very finally, is there a gear?
You had a very good 20 years before then.
That's true. Is there a gear that we can switch to? Are you seeing a gear that we're switching to in terms of our thinking under the pandemic? Are we switching into a better gear of better thinking?
I think this is a fantastic philosophical moment. This is a moment when we can reflect, when we're pulled up short by reality. We go inside and we think, we're isolating. Philosophy has been largely conducted in self-isolation for most of its history. And so that's great. The parallel with Shakespeare is interesting. Shakespeare wrote his poems in times of plague, when the theaters were closed, because he needed to make money. And Shakespeare was, above all, a money maker. He was a blockbuster. He put bums on seats and sold books. So, and I know that Brad isn't monetizing this volume. And so what you've got in a situation like this is a lot of people doing a lot of things for nothing. And, that would have been, Shakespeare wouldn't have done that. he would have expected to get paid. So there's a kind of issue, which is here is an economic issue, which is, I mean, really how we come out of the health side of this crisis into the economic side, which is going to be deeper and more far-reaching, and that's going to require a kind of moral fortitude, which I think philosophy can help with.
Well, it's been really good talking to the both of you, Brad Evans and Simon Critchley. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.